Welcome to the Low Blow Show. I am your host, Immortal Storm, and today I am joined by a very special guest. He is a veteran pro wrestler. He's been a producer, a booker, an agent, a writer, an author, a content creator even, and I've had the privilege and honor to call him my coach, Mike Quackenbush. I'm glad you've made the time to come and speak with me here and share all the knowledge you have. How have you been doing lately? I don't believe I've seen you since July.
Right, yeah, it's been a little while since we've seen each other. I've been keeping pretty busy. The back half
Yeah.
of 2024, I was out on the road pretty hard. I think I may have set like a record for number of seminars taught in a single year. I finished with 107. I think my previous best number was 29. So I feel like I beat that. So it's been pretty busy. How have you been?
So I've took the one match club course over at the Wrestle Factory where you
Mhm.
teach. I've done all that. That was very satisfying, a great experience. That ended in August. And
Right.
since then, I work in foods. It was the holiday season immediately then, and that was pretty brutal. So I have not been in the ring since August. But, mentally, physically, spiritually, I'm doing very well. Currently trying to focus on other things that were put on hold, music and even this show here. And I got very ill at the end of the
Oh,
year. I need to get back in shape. I'm hoping to bulk up, put some muscle on, and then get back in the ring when I feel like, I'm more physically capable of stepping it up a notch.
right. It doesn't hurt to pack a few extra pounds of muscle on before you take to the ring once again.
Yeah. So I've mentioned the Wrestle Factory. This is a school that you founded.
That's right. Yeah, just about 23 years ago, I founded the Wrestle Factory with my then business partner and sometimes tag team partner, the reckless youth, Tom Carter. But Tom has long since retired from wrestling. He's making a good living for himself as an accountant, which is
Uh-huh.
far more sensible than being slammed around the ring, I understand.
Uh-huh. I mean, sometimes the pain is very satisfying and enjoyable in
Sure,
its own
right. It
way.
is its own reward.
Yeah. So you've said you've kept busy. You've made personal, I wouldn't even say personal. I don't know if anybody can dispute the record you've made teaching seminars, but you've made your knowledge so accessible. You have a YouTube channel even.
Mhm.
You post on social media. You've even written books. You have a wealth of knowledge that you really spread out so much. They call you the master of a thousand holds, right? I
Mhm.
mean, in 2025, it's rather easy to find something, and stuff is just a click away to learn or even find a school to go to learn. I know you're of a different generation. How did
Mhm.
you find places to learn? How did you find a school? I know even the practices were not so kind back then. So, how did you become so knowledgeable and what was the grind like?
Right. It was a very different time breaking in the mid 90s when I was coming up. Back then, when the internet was basically in its nascent form, if you didn't get like the free CD in the mail that gave you 5 free hours of America Online, I mean, I don't know how you were getting
Huh.
online back in the day. So it really was as dumbed down as one day I took out my phone book, went through the directory to the business section, the yellow pages. There was nothing for pro wrestling, and I just figured, well, there's nothing here. There's no way in. It was impenetrable. Um, but this wasn't exactly the case. I saw an ad in my newspaper that there was a small show. The company, if they had a name, they didn't advertise it. It just said pro wrestling. And they were bringing in the very recently released Papa Shango and Hacksaw Jim Duggan to wrestle in a garage in my hometown of Reading, PA. So, I mean, that was the first inkling I had that there was anything other than what was on television. I think a lot of people growing up, you imagine wrestling is only what you see on TV, right? So if you grow up watching, like I did, WWF, now WWE, or, AEW, or whatever generation you came up in, that's probably your first exposure. But knowing there's wrestling and finding a door into it were two very different things. So the great irony, I guess, of my story is when I first started out, I had no training whatsoever. I'd say for my first 3 years, And I worked a lot of Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia area events in those 3 years. As I was kind of traveling that Pittsburgh, Eastern Ohio, rural West Virginia circuit, I had no training. I was literally faking it. I realize there's a duplicity to saying that in wrestling, or a duality perhaps. Nevertheless, I made so many mistakes. I had some of the worst injuries of my career in those first 3 years, including fracturing my skull. I had a seizure in the ring and had to be taken out on life support. So this later in life gave me such a respect. It made me value quality training, honing skills to the point, not that wrestling is ever 100% safe. It's not. There's always risk involved. But you can sharpen your skills to diminish the risks. So to end up where I'm at now, as you said, right, like I create a lot of educational content, whether it's about the way we perform wrestling or the culture and the norms around wrestling, et cetera, the history of it. This is all the information I wish I had had access to when I was starting out, because it all seems so opaque. It was so mysterious. How do you get in? And just to give you an example, one of the first places I knew of that would teach wrestling, this makes me think of two examples. Both of these would be in the year 1995, if you want to try and pin it down. So there was a place just outside of Pittsburgh in a shopping mall that was mostly derelict at the time. So much so that they had set up a wrestling ring in what had once been the food court. But because it did so little business, they could just leave the wrestling ring up in the food court. And I guess no one bothered it during normal business hours. But at night, if you paid the guy at the door to the mall who would let you in $50, he'd let you get in there and a couple wrestlers would be in there training. Who were these guys? What were their qualifications? Sometimes you just didn't know. And if you caught them on the wrong night, the only thing you got was beat up. More than once, I was just chopped until my chest ran red with blood. And then they'd say, "Get out of the ring. You're making a mess of the canvas." And I'd be like, I just paid $50 for that? What am I supposed to eat with this week? I'm a college freshman. There was a place in West Virginia. I don't know how people swaddled this back in the day, but they said, yeah, you can go and train there. The trick is you got to train in your tighty whities, and the guy who runs it's going to photograph the training sessions. And I thought, something about that doesn't sound so great. But there were these bizarre hurdles you had to clear to try and find a way in, because there was a real lack of transparency about wrestling, the training, all of that kind of stuff. And I think I could have been saved a whole lot of grief and stress and anxiety and everything else if it had just been clearer at the time. And that motivates a lot of the work I do now.
Yeah, I've always heard horror stories of things just being so abusive or humiliating. And I'm like, how do you learn through that? Like nowadays,
You often
you've got,
don't.
yeah,
Right? Like that's the truth. You would often just get beat up and you'd go home. I don't know what I learned there today. I learned I'm $50 light.
yeah. I mean, now you're so organized with like your seminars, and even you do beginner 101. Like you've got 7 weeks. This day we're learning bumps. This day we're learning how to lock up. This day we're learning this and that. And since I've trained with you, I've looked at other schools just because I'm curious, and
Sure.
I see, just looking like on Instagram, everything just looks healthy, like as far as like the locker room and the classes go. Every time I go to the Wrestle Factory, whether it's just for the workouts or whatever, it's just such a nice vibe. Like, and I get the same feeling that I've gotten when I've used to do open mics. And that feeling is that like we're all chasing the same thing and we're all passionate about the same thing. So there's like, it doesn't even have to be spoken. It's like we all love and respect each other because we're all pursuing that same thing. And being in the ring, we all know the risks. We've all felt this. And it just all feels very healthy compared to anything I ever hear about veterans speak of.
Right. And, it took a while for wrestling to transform. You grow up, or, as I came into the business, I understood this is the culture. These are the norms. This is how people talk. This is how people behave. And you think, well, if I want to get along in the business, I should model myself after this. But the times, they've changed quite a bit since I was breaking in the mid 90s. And things have to change and they have to update and they have to modernize. And I think you really articulated it very well just a moment ago. Ultimately, we're in a room filled with people who are passionate about the same exact thing that we are. And often, when I think back to some of those crazy experiences I had in the 90s, that was not what informed the training environment. What it felt like was, on a lot of occasions, not all, but on a lot of occasions, that it was maybe someone a little embittered at their lack of overall success, who had been hired to teach some lessons to the incoming generation, but saw them as a threat. These guys, these young guys are here to take my job, to take my bookings away. And if I teach them everything I know, they'll be so well equipped that they'll take away all my remaining work. And then I'm left with nothing. And there was like a fearfulness to that, like that comes from a place of insecurity, maybe. But that informed a lot of the training I experienced when I would find a weird hole in the wall where you could go to, learn something for an evening. It seemed like it came from those kind of places as opposed to an appreciation for, hey, we all love this weird thing. We're all trying to get better at it. And, something that's very different in 2025 is there's so much wrestling being made now. Man, you couldn't watch it all in a week if you tried.
Yeah.
I don't know how anyone even if you love WWE more than anything in life, how do you watch it all in a week? You can't. But there's ample opportunity now. Whereas, in the 90s, just as an example, right, in Eastern Ohio, there was one independent company. So if you lived in Eastern Ohio and you wanted to be working all the time, you really had to be in with that one company. Otherwise, it meant more of a drive. Maybe you didn't want to drive to Northern Ohio. Maybe you didn't want to drive across the border into Pennsylvania. Whereas now, just think about, that Pennsylvania, New Jersey area right along the border, from up to the Lehigh Valley, all the way down to Philly and, Cherry Hill, New Jersey. I don't know. There might be 25 independent wrestling organizations just on that hour-long drive. There's so much opportunity now. It's really flipped the dynamic on its head.
I feel like because there are so many independent organizations now and so many people chasing this thing, like, I don't know, it could be argued that it's more difficult to be noticed and break out, to stand out. You know what I mean?
I think it's very similar to what happened to music, more than a decade ago. It's more democratized in that even a small indie band or a solo artist in their basement just working with, they got the right Pro Tools on their computer or whatever, can produce music and have it up in the iTunes store, on Apple Music, through all these distribution models that are out there that can push you to every digital platform. We could make a song tonight and have it on Spotify by Monday morning. Like, that's wild. Independent artists didn't used to have these mechanisms at their disposal. But I'm sure, if we sat down with an aspiring musician and had this same conversation, it would echo a lot of what you just said about wrestling. Yes, there is greater opportunity than ever before, but it's probably never been more difficult to get noticed or even to break out of the pack.
Do you remember, you've gone to so many countries, you've taught so many people that not only have continued to show up week to week, multiple times a week, wherever, but there's also so many that after that first class, they don't show up again. I know you've come across hundreds of students, but do you happen to remember how we first met?
How we first met? I don't know that I remember that exactly. No. Do you have a very clear memory of it?
So, you know what's funny? What got me to first search for a wrestling school, I was on Twitter just watching Monday Night Raw, and I follow so many accounts that just talk wrestling as it's live, right? And one friend online, just a very random up in the air tweet, he just said, "Wrestling fans, do you think you could just do this one day?" And I don't know why that clicked in my head, because I was doing some kickboxing at the time, and I never thought I could do that because I've always been asthmatic and scrawny. And and then so I did that. And then I wanted to learn some grappling then, so I went to a catch wrestling camp.
I do remember
And
that about you. I think you even had shorts on from that camp when we trained.
it was one weekend. It was like a 10-hour thing. But
Wow, that's
so
pretty
that
intense.
so that one tweet just clicked. I was like, you know what? I didn't think I could do those. I'm gonna try this out. And so I just Googled pro wrestling schools near me. And there was a couple up in New York, but I came across the Wrestle Factory. And I was trying to see like who taught this school, who taught this school. Do I know any names here? And I saw Mike Quackenbush, and I'm like, that name is familiar. And I saw Chikara and all that, and I'm like, oh, I know that thing. Like, I remember that one viral clip of you and Claudio doing that crazy thing, and I'm like,
Oh yeah.
So I love chain wrestling and grappling. I want to learn from this guy, and I discovered your YouTube channel until we make it, and I saw that you do all these things to put it out there to invite people to come learn. So eventually I found out you were doing a beginner 101. Or actually, it wasn't even that yet. It was a free intro to pro wrestling workshop.
Oh yeah.
So there was that. But before that, on the same day, it was just a seminar. I don't even know what it was of specifically, but the seminar was for those that have had some level of training. And then, of course, 2 hours after would be the free workshop for those with zero training. And I thought, well, since these are just back to back, I'm going to sign up for both. But the seminar, which I should have had experience in going in, I walked into, and I walk in the door. I was a little late because it was a 2.5 hour drive for me. And I remember people were taking bumps or rolling around or whatever it may have been. And you look over as I walked in and you're like, are you John Carlos? And I'm like, yeah. And you're like, come on in. We're going over some holds. And I'm like, okay, cool. So I get in the ring and you're like, all right, right now we were just going over a snap suplex. And I'm like, that doesn't sound like a hold, but all right. And I was like, just so you know, I've never taken a bump before. And you're like, oh, you don't need to know so much about a bump for this. So you're like, all right, so we're going to grab you by the head like this, and just make sure you plant your feet flat. That's all you got to know for right now. And I'm like, okay. And I did not land flat on my feet. My right ankle smacked the canvas, and 30 seconds in just being in a wrestling ring, I already sprained an ankle. And then so we continue on with that seminar, and I could feel more and more pain throughout the session. I didn't know it was a complete sprain. I've never had an injury of sorts because I've never been an athletic involved person. But so we did a couple things. I remember, I believe it's called a cazadora. We did a cross chest, transitioning to hammer lock and other stuff. So there was all that I learned to do a couple things on this sprained ankle. And then there was the free intro to pro wrestling workshop.
Once you were good and warmed up.
Yeah. So did all that. And so I technically did 4 hours of learning my first day on this sprained ankle. And it's weird because I was having so much fun that the pain was so in the back of my mind. And I remember at one point we were going over bumps. Like once we learned how to take our first bump, we would run into you and you would either just present an elbow or a chop, and we would just take our bump. And I don't know if I choked, I got too close, I don't know what it was, but I remember your foot hitting me right in the ribs. And I had a separated rib from that catch wrestling camp that was just 2 weeks prior.
Oh man.
And this is the thing about pro wrestling training is that, so I ran into you, you kicked me right in my separated rib that was not 100%, and I felt like vomiting immediately.
Yeah, I bet.
And while I was down, this weird thing happened where the other trainees, they start doing the and they start stomping and clapping so that I may stand back up, just like you would see at an actual wrestling show. It was just the most impromptu thing among all of us who have never been in a ring before. And like, this is not a show. This is a class here. And I thought that was just so weird. And like when taking classes, like selling was always just so awkward to me when you're not actually performing.
Mhm.
Like pro wrestling class, it was all just so, in a good way, bizarre to me.
Right. Yeah, it is. Right. I mean, that sums it all up. It's a very bizarre experience. Like you said, I think a lot of people, they struggle with that idea of, right, selling, emoting, shining out their pain while they're training. And yet, like, right, I'm a big believer in this. The habits you build in training are ultimately what you'll default to when you're performing. So in order to make sure that, your selling is loud, that it's compelling, you got to practice it. But it is weird when you're in an empty room, right? There's no fans
Uh,
in. It's not a show, but you got to practice those skills, right? Bizarre is the right word.
so I did that workshop, that seminar, and then I did Beginner 101. And just doing this course, this 7-week course that you laid out, it really made me love the art so much more because I understood it on deeper levels in how it works. Like, I don't want to be so in detail and peel back the curtain and reveal things, but I learned that pro wrestling is very much a language in
Mhm.
itself. Like, I always wondered, I don't know if you remember when WWE had the Cruiserweight Classic,
Right.
and there was this match between Cedric Alexander and Kota Ibushi, and they had a match of the year candidate. And I always questioned, I was so curious. I'm like, I believe this guy's American, speaks English. This guy's Japanese, speaks Japanese. I'm like, I know they talk in the ring, right? I know they plan things. Like, if they don't speak the same language, how do they go 20 minutes? Like, it just wasn't computing to me. I'm like, how do they do that? How do they plan or discuss anything when there's a verbal language barrier?
Yeah.
And then being in the ring, I learned that a lot of it is body language, and you're not just working with the other person, but you're working with the ring itself. Like it's
Mhm.
an instrument. So like you learn movement, you learn how to move around the ring. Like these things must be done in a clockwise motion. These things are done with the right side of the body. If you're doing this, it has to be followed up with this. And just like the English language, it's like you learn a noun, a verb, an adjective, and it's like, oh, an adjective goes before the noun, a noun goes before the verb. Once you learn these little things, you know how to put them together without a second thought, right? And so I'm like, okay, so just like pro wrestling, you learn how to lock up and then you learn this and that, you learn positioning and you learn how to read the other person. And there's no need to really speak sometimes.
That's right. Right. The physical language of wrestling has its own grammar, right?
Uh-huh.
We could speak two totally separate languages, but once we grab each other, right, we're speaking the physical language of wrestling. And yeah, I think people often underestimate how powerful that is,
Mhm.
the physical part of the job. Because while yes, a lot of the work could be done verbally, when you don't have that to avail yourself of, you must one count on certain universalities of wrestling. A body slam to a Japanese guy is the same as a body slam is to an American guy. But just like you pointed out there, right? Um, there are certain like grammatical rules, perhaps, for lack of a different expression there, that define the art form.
Mhm. And now when I watch pro wrestling, I'm like, I feel like I've always been a very analytical person. So like now I watch and I feel like I can tell when they're just working on the fly because I feel like
Mhm.
the pace is more steady and brought down and things might even be a little sloppier, but it's more real in that sense. And I'm like, okay, I'm like, I feel like they're just calling it right then and there. And then something elaborate happens and it's like, okay, well, that had to be practiced.
Right.
Um, but I've always been so fascinated with just how a match is put together and how people from different countries or different styles just do this thing together. It's always been so fascinating to me.
right? And it's always different. Every example is different. Even if there's one guy who you like to study and watch, because no two opponents are the same. Seeing, that wrestler paired with one person, the way that they're going to combine their talents or discover chemistry with a second person will be totally different. There's somebody they might be very comfortable wrestling with, and in the very next match, you see them, they're meeting someone for the very first time, and that match will feel totally different. And it's a constant process of discovery. And some people, they learn to get comfortable with that. I'm a big believer in that. To an extent, wrestling is learning to live with discomfort. You can interpret that in a variety of ways, right? Of course, I mean the physical discomfort that comes with wrestling, but it's that discomfort of you might walk into an arena tomorrow night, meet someone for the very first time, and then realize you're going to be in the ring together for 15 minutes. And this person who I just met, I have to trust them with my safety, with my life. So, for some people, that's a very uncomfortable proposition.
And it is always scary getting into that ring. I often, like I said, it's a 2.5 hour drive for me to get to the Wrestle Factory. And for several years now, I've struggled with anxiety every single time, every single time when I drive there, I am filled with anxiety. I have trouble breathing on the way there. And once I get there, I have to go to the bathroom to just literally just breathe. Because even when things are going right, like now, I don't hit the back of my head anymore, but you never know. I'm learning a new type of bump, and now now it's more awkward, and I have to make this adjustment. And it's like, oh, well, now I just landed on my elbows and hurt myself. And I'm always afraid of getting injured. And mostly it's because what was most difficult for me in the beginning was tucking my chin and not hitting the back of my head. And I remember the first couple times whacking my head so hard, and I just start overthinking. I'm like, I've never had a concussion before. To what degree, like, how much harder does my head have to hit for me to actually have one? I'm like, if the next time I hit my head, if that triggers concussion, I won't be able to drive home. This ruins my whole week. I'm like, every single time, it's just anxiety for me. But I have so much fun learning and doing things that it just so slightly outweighs the fear. So I continue to do it.
Right. Yeah. You've got to find that balance. I think the exact kind of nerves you're describing are quite common. I don't think you're the only person who feels that way going into practice. I think, you mentioned a couple minutes ago that intro workshop that we do at the Wrestle Factory. We maybe do it 4 or 5 times a year, something like that. Without fail, half the people who sign up do not show up. So my average fulfillment rate on that is 50%. If 10 people sign up for the workshop, only 5 will show up. And I'll bet you, of those 5 who don't show up, it's because most of them talk themselves out of it. That moment where you get in the car, but you actually drive to the Wrestle Factory, they walk to the car and then they just turn around and go back in the house, right? And it's for those reasons. Of course, people are afraid of injury, right? Or they're afraid of the unknown. What if they beat me up at this class? Blah, blah, blah. Whatever people think in their minds. But that anxiety that they feel is very real.
And it's funny when talking about the physicality of it, because you have a video on your channel in which you deconstruct the ring and you show how it's built. And it's like, you've got 8x12 boards laid across and then a traditional wrestling mat on top of it. And every time I take a bump, I feel like I do not feel the mat. I feel like I always just feel the wood. And like people talk about like the give, like when you see some of the biggest guys take a bump and you see the ring go in a little bit, like there's some give to it. And in my head, I'm like, I don't feel that give. I just feel the stiff wood.
Sure. And I think, for lighter weight guys, I've been a lightweight or junior heavyweight my whole career. Like I've never come close to hitting the heavyweight benchmark. Even before the rings were constructed the way they are now, they used to have a gigantic compression spring in the center. And I've only, in my 30 plus years of wrestling, I've only ever seen a few rings like this. But in the previous years, right, going back to the 80s and the 70s and even before, those rings with the giant spring under the center only gave under the weight of someone that was over 200 pounds. So that if you and I walked out there and started slamming and suplexing each other, the ring would have no give whatsoever. So, while I'm glad to see how rings have evolved a little bit to be a little more forgiving, even so, there are days where you hit that ring and you're like, isn't this thing supposed to give? And it doesn't always feel like it does.
So how different are rings in all the places you've traveled? I know, I believe at the Wrestle Factory, it's an 18 by 18 and it's steel
Right.
cables, and WWE's 2020 with the actual rope.
That's right.
How many different variations of rings have you come across, and what's, I don't even know how to put it, the training itself, how different perhaps is it, like transitioning from the different square meter or the different ropes?
So, in terms of how many variations I've seen, it depends how granular you want to get. I'll give you some examples. About a year ago, I think it was almost exactly a year ago, I was in Trinidad and Tobago. The ring that I trained in there, it had no padding on it whatsoever. So it was just a gray piece of fabric pulled over the boards. So you were basically just falling directly on the boards. A lot of the rings I wrestled and trained in Mexico were boxing rings. So they had not been modified for wrestling purposes, meaning that the center had no give in it at all. It was just like falling on the floor. So I've seen so many different variations. In fact, there was a show I did in Mexico where the ropes were just empty green garden hose from like a hardware store. Go to the garden section and just buy like a coil of green garden hose. And that was it. They just strung the garden hose around it to make ropes. So every ring is its own beast, so to speak. That's why I'm a big believer in, I want to get there early and I want to walk the whole ring myself. Like, what do I feel under my feet? What do I feel if I try to hit the ropes? I do it for my own safety, first and foremost. But if I'm running the class or I'm going to perform a match that night, I want to know what I'm in for, because it does require some adjustment. In terms of like the square footage changing, in fact, it was just a few months ago, for the first time ever, I was in a 10 by 10 ring. That's the smallest ring I've ever seen with my own two eyes. It almost felt like being in a baby's crib. It felt so small compared to an 18 square foot, or, like they have at the WWE's Performance Center, the 20 by 20 rings. That feels like an Olympic sized swimming pool compared to a 10 by 10. But it's often a matter of just adding an extra step. To go, for example, if it takes me 4 strides to cross an 18-foot ring, it will take me 5 to cross a 20-foot. Or I have to drop down 1 if I'm in a 16-foot. So those adjustments, from years of experience, I know how to make them pretty readily. But, it can throw you for a loop. The first time you change to a different size ring, it can feel very alien.
So you spent your entire 2024 traveling, teaching seminars and such. Like I said, you're a wealth of knowledge. Is there anything you learned from some classes specifically, like, oh man, I never thought of teaching this that way, or I never thought this was practiced in this way, or maybe some things that culture shocked you? Because I know you've been down in South America, Europe.
Right. I love seeing the little weird regional nuances. One, a lot of it's vocabulary based. I would show something and they would say, oh, you call it this? Well, we call it that. And I'd be interested to know, well, where did you learn that? Where did that come from? I'm always intrigued by those kinds of differences. I definitely learned on the road that I need more adaptations, because my seminars attract people of all shapes and sizes. And what I found is some of what I teach does not adapt well when I have super heavyweights in class. If I have people that are 275, 300 pounds or more in class, some of what I teach really doesn't work for some super heavyweights. It made me realize if I want people to feel like anyone can come take these classes, the last thing I want is for someone to leave feeling like, oh, I couldn't really do any of that because, I was too big or whatever the case
Mhm.
might be. It did make me kind of come away realizing I need modifications or adaptations to make sure when I do get a super heavyweight in class, I don't want the 350-pound guy to feel like, oh, there's nothing here for me. So that part of it was very eye opening because I got to see so many people all over the world, every shape, size, and experience level. It was such a good sampling, a wide sampling of experience levels and body types and everything else. And it made me realize some of the shortcomings of my own work. So as I'm getting ready to go back out there, this year I've got Australia. It looks like a period of time in South America is upcoming, maybe a couple stops in Europe as well, and then wherever in North America I can fit in between. I want to be as ready to meet like the current class of wrestlers as possible without feeling like I would never want somebody to be like, well, if I'm not the same body type as Mike, I'm not going to learn anything from his classes.
Mhm.
No, I've always been able to teach. I think if you look at the 1,000 or so people I've trained throughout the years, I train them of all shapes and sizes. You don't have to be necessarily agile. You don't necessarily have to be technically minded. I want you to walk away from the class feeling like, one, I learned something, and two, leaving with a greater appreciation for the art form. I think it's really important that's baked into everything that I teach. I want my love of wrestling to come through very clearly.
Mhm. So you do all these seminars, of course, teaching physically in the ring and such, but you've also written several books. And I know one of them is more the history of pro wrestling, and a couple others are being a better performer and such. Some of your books, like Toolbox and others, would you say those are only for the pro wrestler, or can a fan that doesn't really do anything in the ring, would they get something out of that also?
Certainly, I wrote them for fellow pro wrestlers. What a layperson might take from the book is hard for me to guess. I think if you just have a lot of curiosity about wrestling, like if you just love it, right? And I think a lot of people kind of go through a phase. I'm describing myself here where I was a fan first and I fell in love with the art form and I wanted to know everything about it. So for me, as a kid in the 90s, that meant I would buy all the magazines and I had to play all the video games and I had to watch every episode that was on TV and I had to talk about it with my friends. And then all of a sudden, my school projects were all about wrestling too.
Uh,
Like everything just became wrestling all the time. If books like that were available to read, I think I would have read them, even if I only maybe took away 20% of its real meaning or value because I had that curiosity. Um, how much you take away from it, I guess, maybe it comes down to how much you already speak the language of wrestling, which in the current era, right, we're very much in the social media era of wrestling now, the fourth era. People's understanding of the art form has advanced to the point that when they do the cold open of Raw on Netflix, they're talking about faces and heels and shoots and works. Nobody knew what these words meant, in 1992. You wouldn't have seen these in a copy of Pro Wrestling Illustrated. We're just at a very different place now. And that makes it hard for me to guess if someone who had never been in a ring read Toolbox Building Better Pro Wrestling, how much would they take away? I don't really know.
mm. Do you think your 2024 odyssey of touring, teaching, might that spawn another book?
Definitely. So I'm currently at work on my 11th wrestling book. Tentatively, it's called Your Best Match. And I want to give a framework that is easy to follow. It's rife with examples so that if you feel like you're reading some of it and you don't understand, there's a match associated with this you could watch and you could see it with your own two eyes to help people really build satisfying matches that deliver in the ring, but also give a complete story to the audience. Um, Underneath it all, I think great wrestling is ultimately great storytelling. For that to be true, that means we are also all storytellers. So, understanding basic story structure, how do you apply it? How do you put wrestling moves to it? And then how do you take that out to the ring and entertain an audience? I think That's one of those magic pieces when I think back to my very early years. I wish I had that information.
Uh, is there anything outside of wrestling that you have in rotation? Like you're an avid book reader of other things?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm almost done with the newest Malcolm Gladwell book right now. I've got about 80 pages to go. Revenge of the Tipping Point. He's probably my favorite author. I think I've read everything Gladwell's put out. And when I can too, I still try to dabble. I was a lifelong comic book fan. And before all my disposable income was eaten up by wrestling, I was the guy every Wednesday at the comic book shop. So I've got a couple trade paperbacks for Christmas that I've got to make my way through. So I like to keep a nice variety. I try to balance my fiction and my nonfiction.
I've always compared WWE to comic books. Like pro wrestling literally is live comic book. Like the ending to Cody versus Roman at WrestleMania 40 last year, everybody compared it to the end of Avengers Endgame, right?
Mhm.
I'm like, it's literally the same thing. I'm always like, anytime I see somebody's like, oh, I'm not a fan of pro wrestling, this and that, I'm like, but you're a fan of this. It's the same thing.
Sure. There still is that stigma around wrestling, right?
Do you think you'd ever write a comic book?
Sure. I had a chance to try my hand at that a couple times in the heyday of Chikara. There were a few comic books we put out, and I wrote a couple of those stories. Any of the ones there that are uncredited, those came directly from me. And yeah, I would love the opportunity to try my hand at that kind of thing because pairing the story with sequential artwork really you're right in that there's a lot of parallels between wrestling and comic books. The difference is how do you marry the story to sequential art? If what you've got are 6, 7, 8 panels per page, as opposed to, two people performing it basically in the ring to bring the narrative to life. Converting stories from one to the other is a very exciting challenge. And long before I loved pro wrestling, I grew up loving comic books. So that storytelling form is something I have a deep appreciation and admiration for.
Mm. I feel like it could translate well in that if there's a near fall on this second to last page, you don't know if the kick out or the 3 count happens until you turn that last page. I feel like you can translate the drama in a way.
Mhm. Right. I think a lot of the storytelling bones underneath it all are the same.
Mm. Well, I don't know if you've got to go at the moment. We did have a 45-minute window to work with.
I've got yeah, just a minute or two left, but I really do appreciate you having me on and thanks. And I also appreciate too, a lot of times when I do podcasts or other things like this, it feels like people have just read my Wikipedia page about 2 minutes before we start recording, and then they
Uh,
just want me to regurgitate that. So thank you very much for not putting me through that tortuous process.
I thank you for simply saying, "Yeah, I'll be on." Well, I'm glad we could do this. I can't wait to be in the ring again, not just to learn from you, but the other coaches over at the Wrestle Factory. They've become great friends. They're great people. Coach Josh, Coach Danny. They always want me to come to a pro wrestling workout, but it's not so often I get the Thursday off to actually go. But for me personally, I do also want to try to explore other schools. I did train with Drew Gulak over WrestleMania weekend because I'm like, oh man, that's actually an hour closer to me. And I know he was a student of yours.
Yeah, that's right.
So for my 2025, I'll try to explore more schools at some point. Do you have any goals for 2025?
I definitely want to try to visit at least 2 countries where I've never been, for wrestling purposes, I mean. I want to try and get out there and see more of the world. Um, I had gone through a weird period, this is quite a few years back, where I really grew to resent international travel. I think maybe I had just kind of overbooked myself. And then in the years that followed, anytime I had a really interesting international offer, I would just say no out of habit. I didn't want to do it anymore. But I mean, I learned a lot of things during the pandemic. But one thing about being trapped indoors, it really gave me my appreciation for travel back. And getting out there, like I did last year a little bit, I'd never been to Argentina before. I'd never been to Chile before. And I loved it. It really helped rekindle my love of international travel. And because I always pair it with wrestling work, I know that even if I did go somewhere and maybe the city or the country didn't exactly, I wasn't exactly enamored of it. Where I'm going, I'm always going to be met by people who love the same weird art form I do. And in many ways, right, that makes up for the rest.
Yeah, you'll feel welcome.
Hmm.
All right. So I thank you for joining me and discussing the layers and such of training in pro wrestling. Thank you for listening. You can follow the Low Blow Show on practically every platform, even Blue Sky and Threads. Now TikTok's back. So I'm going to be posting clips there as much as I can as well. But also follow Mike Quackenbush. I mean, the guy is also on YouTube with Till We Make It. You can learn a lot from there. The man's got several books to learn from and a great school with great teachers. Mike, thanks for joining me.
Oh, yeah. My pleasure. Thanks again.
I hope we can do this again and dissect layers of pro wrestling again in another sense at some time.
Yeah. Right on. That sounds like fun.
Thank you.